Hello. Thank you for joining me again. I appreciate you. And I'm excited. Last week was my first in the series that's covering my book. So last week was the introduction, and this week is chapter one of Yucky, Yummy, Savory, Sweet, Understanding the Flavors of Emotions. This book dives into the predictive nature of the brain. I was mesmerized by this concept. I shared a couple of these stories in my very first episode, but it doesn't hurt to repeat them. And that's what I'm going to do. We live in a time delay. One night when I was sick and I was in our bedroom, and my husband, who was on the other side of our bedroom wall, was watching TV in that room. And I could hear us watching the same show because our house is very echoey. It really is. But still, I could hear it. We have one of those cable boxes, the ones that do the recordings and you can reverse, and they're always on delay. So I'm like, okay, this is annoying because I'm watching it as the sound is coming out, and then I'll hear it a few seconds later on his end. Put on some headphones. Quick, easy solve. But it's really a metaphor for how we go through life. We are constantly on a time delay. Maybe not as big as that one, but we're on a time delay. Our brain is always predicting what to do ahead of our experience. And that's good, right? Because if we didn't have that, it would be hard for us to get up. As we make the intention and we know we want to get up, your brain is ahead of itself, like getting everything into gear and, your heart rate going up, getting the muscles engaged, whatever it takes to get you to stand up. So the brain's always working in advance. And this is true for everything. Our brain is constantly predicting how much water we need to drink, how much food we need to eat, what color something is. That whole famous philosophical question is, if we both look at a red rose, do we see the same color red? We don't know because everything's in our head. And I talk about that in another chapter. But we are living in a predictive world. And that's really what this chapter is about, and giving you evidence for it. The title of the chapter is Opus One, Two-Buck Chuck, and the Wine Snob. It's a true story where I went to a party and the host had a table of beautiful wines. He's a wine connoisseur. He had a huge collection, and it was New Year's Eve, so he was ready to have some fun with the few of us that were there to have this kind of like, let's get started on the celebration party. His friend showed up late, went to the table of wines, saw a bottle of Opus One, which is a very fancy wine brand out of Napa. If you go to the winery, you don't buy it, you acquire it. Very, hoity-toity. It's expensive. It's iconic. It's been around a long time. Their Cabernet Sauvignon is very well known. It's a collector bottle, right? And both his friend Bob and Dan, the host, they collected it. They've had this wine before. So this bottle of Opus One was on the table when Bob got there. Bob poured a glass, took a sip, and said, "Oh, I love this wine." We all started to giggle. He figured something was up. Took another sip, and he's like, "This isn't Opus One." Dan says, "You idiot, you just drank Two-Buck Chuck." So for those of you who don't know, Two-Buck Chuck is a bargain brand. I mean, it was $2 at the time. Today, I think it's $4.99. It's not aged in fancy French oak barrels. It's aged with oak chips. It's not something that Trader Joe's employees say, "Oh, would you like to acquire this?" They just like, "Yeah, you buying it? Great." I'm not disparaging the wine. I mean, it's fine, but it certainly would not be mistaken for an Opus One Cabernet Sauvignon. especially by someone who was familiar with it. So, what's the deal? The first taste was his expectation. It was his brain predicting what those flavors on his palate would taste like. Because Opus One, he knows Dan has good wines, and he also has had it before. So he knows it's good. So his brain gave him that, even though it wasn't Opus One. The second sip was more consciously consumed. That was when he said, "This isn't it." There was no miracle. Jesus did not come and make cheap wine into fancy wine. It was the prediction by Bob's brain. Now, I hope that that makes sense to you, because this is not about wine. Our brain is predicting all the time, not just with wine. We do it with food. We do it with people. It does this for everything we experience. It's using our past experiences, call them memories, call them what you want, but it's using them to predict the future. I tell another story that I think is a good story to understand how it's important to be more active in creating these experiences so that your brain has better recipes to use in the future. There's a story of a Buddhist monk who's walking down a country path and spies something long, thin, and coiled and says, "Ah, a snake." And of course, it wasn't just any snake, it was a poisonous snake. So, of course, fear, panic, all this stuff is taking over. He's trying to figure out, like, what am I going to do? I don't want to die. He's trying to figure it out. And in the process, he makes a torch, a little makeshift torch. I guess he was going to burn it. And he comes closer to this snake and he sees it's a rope. So somebody must have dropped the rope ahead of him. And he thought it was a snake because of how it fell. You would think that it would be obvious, but his brain doesn't have the experience of having a piece of rope on that trail. So he went straight into panic with that prediction and didn't look much closer until he had that torch. What if he had been raised by a bunch of snake handlers, like a family of snake handlers or reptile experts? His brain would have predicted better because it has that experience. If out of fear he had turned around and gone home another way, he probably would have told all of his fellow villagers of this poisonous snake, and yet poisonous snake doesn't exist. They would have had fear walking that path, and so would he. So all these people would have fear in them, all because of a rope. But the story goes that once a snake is a rope, it can never be a snake again, because he didn't succumb to his fears and at least was cautiously going towards this deadly rope. He was able to recognize it, and he would be able to recognize it in the future. Now, that experience was forced upon him, but we can create experiences through curiosity. You understand that it is important for us to not just take everything at face value, at our first reaction, to take a second sip like Bob did, but more consciously. This applies to all of life because our brain is predicting our whole existence. And when we become more familiar with that, when we understand that, wow, I could have gotten this wrong, like I could have perceived this incorrectly, and my emotions could be driving this perception. So that's it for our podcast today. Just so you know, I put my podcasts on YouTube. If you go to Flavors of Emotions, there's a playlist called Yucky, Yummy, Savory, Sweet. So if you want to listen to the whole chapter, it's all there for you. Next week, we're going to cover the chapter, Ingredients for How We Feel, Think, and Behave. To me, it's kind of fun because I like all this brain stuff. It's really, really interesting to me. And you may not be into science. And I realize that there's a lot more people who are not into it than who are. It's not about being into science, it's about understanding how we work. Because if you don't like your life, or you don't feel like you know yourself, or you feel disconnected from the world, it's important that we learn how to sync up our sensory experiences to our body, because the majority of our sensory input comes from the world. And when we can sync it up to our body and we can connect to that, then we are able to learn more about ourselves. It gives us agency. And that's kind of my new favorite word right now is agency. And as it relates to being a human, to being, it's not like a marketing agency, but human agency is an individual's capacity to determine and make meaning from their environment through conscious, reflective, and creative action. That's what I'm trying to do, is help you to be creative. Maybe you didn't even know that you could be creative with your emotions. Yep, that's what I'm all about, making you more creative with your emotions. So till next week, when we talk a little bit more about the senses, thanks for listening and take good care.